August 5th, 2019, Belfast. 130 men and women refused to leave. They had been inside for 6 days, already occupying the shipyard where their fathers had worked and their fathers' fathers before them. Outside, cameras, union reps, a handful of politicians who'd shown up because showing up was free. Inside, empty dry docks, silent cranes, and the sound of nothing being built. Joe had started here in 1981. Back then, there were 8,000 workers inside these gates. Now it was down to him and 129 others. The message came through at 9 a.m. An administrator had been appointed. The company would file for insolvency by the following morning. 158 years. From a 2-acre scrapyard on a sandbank in the River Lagan to the company that built the largest ships the world had ever seen. And it was going to end with a form filed in a court that most of these workers had never set foot in. But this wasn't the first time Harland and Wolff had been declared dead. And the real story of how it got here, how an empire's greatest shipyard became a casualty of the empire itself, starts not in 2019, but in 1858, with 2 strangers and a piece of reclaimed land that nobody wanted. It started with mud. In 1841, the Belfast Harbor Commissioners hired men to dredge the River Lagan. The silt they pulled up got piled on top of a sandbank just off the eastern shore. By the time they were done, they'd created 17 acres of flat, usable land out of nothing. They called it Queen's Island. Nobody knew what to do with it. 17 years later, a 27-year-old engineer from Yorkshire arrived in Belfast with a skill set and a problem. The skill set? Shipbuilding. The problem? No money of his own. Edward James Harland had been obsessed with ships since he was a teenager. At 16, he'd apprenticed on the Tyne. By the time he reached Belfast, he was running a failing shipyard for a man named Robert Hickson, a businessman who owned the land but had no idea what to do with it. Harland did. In 1858, with £5,500 raised through a contact named Gustav Schwabe, he bought the yard outright. Then he called in a favor. Gustav Wilhelm Wolff was born in Hamburg in 1834 to a Jewish-German family. He'd come to England at 15, worked his way up, and ended up as Harland's private assistant. He wasn't the engineering genius that was Harland. What Wolff brought was something arguably more valuable in Victorian Britain: connections. His uncle, Gustav Schwabe, had invested in a shipping line called Bibby Brothers. The first orders for the new firm went to Harland and Wolff from Bibby Brothers. This wasn't corruption. This was how Victorian Britain worked. Trust was a currency, and family networks were the banking system. But Harland brought something else: actual technical innovation. He replaced wooden upper decks with iron. He flattened ship bottoms so the same length of hull could carry 30% more cargo. Shipping companies noticed quickly. The little Belfast yard built ships that were stronger, more efficient, and cheaper to run. By 1870, Harland and Wolff had signed an exclusive arrangement with a shipping company called the White Star Line. H&W would build only for White Star. White Star would order only from H&W. It was a contract that would make both of them legendary. But the man who would push this company to the absolute edge of human ambition hadn't walked through the gates yet. In 1868, a 15-year-old apprentice arrived on Queen's Island. His name was William Peary, and within 30 years, he would turn this Belfast shipyard into something the British Empire had never seen and set in motion forces that would eventually destroy everything he built. William James Peary was born in Quebec in 1847 and grew up in Northern Ireland. He was not the most technically gifted man in the yard, but he understood something that his predecessors didn't. In the age of steam and steel, size itself was a form of power. 27 years from apprentice to chairman. Under Peary, Harland and Wolff expanded from a notable regional shipbuilder into something closer to an industrial empire. By 1897, the yard covered 80 acres and employed 10,000 workers. Every morning at 6 a.m., the shipyard whistle blew, and thousands of men streamed from East Belfast's terraced streets toward the docks. Riveters, carpenters, boilermakers, electricians. Fathers brought sons, sons brought grandsons. The identity of entire neighborhoods was woven into this place. Then, in 1907, Peary had dinner with J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line. By the time they left the table, they had sketched out an idea on paper. 3 ships, not just big, the largest moving objects ever built by human hands. To build them, Harland and Wolff demolished 3 existing slipways and replaced them with 2 larger ones. They hired the same engineering firm that built the Forth Bridge and Tower Bridge, William Errol & Co., to construct a gantry crane over the slipways. 228 feet tall, the largest crane structure in the world at the time. Cost £100,000. On March 31, 1909, the keel of ship 401 was laid. You know it as the Titanic. For the next 26 months, roughly 3,000 workers labored on that hull every single day. 3 million rivets, a workforce of 15,000 across the yard, and these 3,000 men represented a fifth of all of them. Their weekly wage, £2, 246 recorded injuries during construction. 8 deaths. Their names, almost forgotten. On May 31, 1911, approximately 100,000 people lined the banks of the River Lagan to watch the Titanic slide into the water. The launch took 62 seconds. Less than a year later, April 15, 1912, at 2:20 a.m., she was gone. The man who had designed her was Peary's nephew, Thomas Andrews, H&W's chief naval architect. He went down with the ship. The British government's subsequent inquiry concluded that Harland and Wolff bore no responsibility for the disaster. The company survived. More than survived. In the 30 years that followed, it would reach its absolute peak, because the world was about to go to war. Twice. But behind that peak, William Peary was hiding something. A secret that would only be discovered after his death. And that would be the first crack in the foundation of everything he'd built. War needs steel. And no one could deliver steel like Harland and Wolff. During World War I, the yard converted merchant ships into armed merchant cruisers, repaired submarines, and built gunboats. Peary served the British wartime government directly as controller of merchant shipbuilding. He was, by this point, one of the most powerful industrialists in the British Empire. But in 1924, on a voyage to South Africa, William Peary died at sea. When his estate was examined, accountants found a massive financial hole. Peary had been using complex accounting to mask years of actual losses. The books had looked healthy. They weren't. This was the first crack. No one could see it yet because another war came and filled every gap with demand. World War II was Harland and Wolff's greatest hour. During the conflict, the yard built 6 aircraft carriers, 2 cruisers, including the now famous HMS Belfast, and 131 other warships. They repaired more than 22,000 vessels of all types. They manufactured tank components and artillery parts. The yard was running at maximum capacity around the clock. Then, in April and May of 1941, the Luftwaffe came. The Belfast Blitz was the heaviest bombing Northern Ireland had ever experienced. The Queen's Island facilities were severely damaged. The aircraft manufacturing plant on site was destroyed. And in the archives room, the original design drawings for the Titanic, the most detailed surviving record of how that ship was built, burned, gone. But the shipyard held. The workers came back. Production resumed. By the peak of the war effort, Harland and Wolff employed 35,000 people, 35,000, in a city of roughly 440,000 people. 1 in every 12 people in Belfast worked here. This wasn't just a company, it was the economic spine of Northern Ireland, the physical expression of British industrial power, the factory that kept the empire afloat. The war ended in 1945. The empire had about 15 years left. And nobody told those 35,000 workers that the industry their entire lives were built around was already in its final act. Because while Belfast was rebuilding from the Blitz, the shipyards that would eventually destroy Harland and Wolff were already being rebuilt from rubble in a country that had just lost the war. In the 1890s, British shipyards built 80% of the world's new tonnage. By 1970, that number was 6%. This is not a story of laziness or incompetence. It is a story about a structural shift that was probably unstoppable, but that British industry and British government made considerably worse by refusing to look at it directly. After World War II, Japan rebuilt its industrial base using entirely new methods: modular prefabrication, precision quality control, ruthless adherence to delivery timelines. Japanese yards could build more ships, with fewer workers, in less time. The math was brutal, and it was not close. Meanwhile, British shipyards, including Harland and Wolff, remained stuck in older working patterns. Complex demarcation, disputes between trades, chronic delivery delays, sustained management union conflict. H&W had some of the best equipped facilities in the world. It was eating that advantage alive with high wages and low output. Between 1953 and 1962, Harland and Wolff completed just 25 large vessels. Profit in 1961, less than £150,000. A decade earlier, profits had exceeded £1 million. Then came the jet plane. In the early 1960s, transatlantic air travel collapsed the market for ocean liners almost overnight. The great passenger ships that had been the prestige projects of Harland and Wolff, the ships that defined the yard's identity, were suddenly obsolete. The British government saw the crisis and responded with the wrong tool: subsidies. From 1964 onward, Harland and Wolff received government loans and grants designed to protect jobs. But the money mostly covered losses rather than funding genuine modernization. Meanwhile, fixed-price contracts combined with surging inflation meant that every late delivery cost the company money it didn't have. In 1971, the British government began taking equity stakes in H&W. By 1974, the company's net assets were negative £32 million. In 1975, the government completed its nationalization of Harland and Wolff. This was presented as a rescue. It was a postponement. After the 1973 oil crisis, demand for the supertankers H&W had specialized in collapsed entirely. The government continued subsidizing the construction of ships nobody wanted, then sold them at a loss to shipping companies, who parked them in harbors. Public money paid for ships. Ships sat in ports and rusted. The workforce that had numbered 35,000 at its peak was down to 3,000 by the time the government decided to privatize the company in 1989. 3,000 people, from 35,000. This was not just a statistic. This was East Belfast. These were streets that had organized themselves around the rhythm of that shipyard whistle streets, where the decline of H&W showed up in closed pubs, empty schools, men in their 50s with skills that the modern economy had no use for. Norwegian shipping magnate Fred Olsen bought the company. It was restructured as Harland and Wolff Holdings Limited, and a yard that had once employed an army began to figure out what it could still be. The answer: it found bridges, offshore platforms, oil rigs was a practical one, but it was also an admission. The thing that had made Harland and Wolff matter was gone. What came next was a story about survival, and survival turned out to be harder than anyone expected. After 1989, Harland and Wolff rebuilt itself around whatever could be built in a big dry dock that wasn't ships. Some standard Suezmax tankers, North Sea oil platforms, steel bridge construction, the James Joyce Bridge in Dublin, restoration work on Dublin's Halfpenny Bridge, the Foyle Bridge in Londonderry. A yard that built the largest ship in the world was now building bridges. No one said it out loud. Everyone felt it. Then, in the late 1990s, came a moment of what looked like genuine revival. H&W entered the bidding for the Royal Navy's future aircraft carrier program, the ships that would eventually become HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales. The contract would have been transformative. They lost the bid when the UK defence procurement process consolidated around BAE Systems. In 2003, Harland and Wolff completed its final true shipbuilding contract, MV Anvil Point, a military sealift vessel built for the UK Ministry of Defence. From 1861 to 2003, 142 years, approximately 1,700 vessels, and then silence. The Goliath crane, the smaller of the two, was placed in hibernation, mothballed, still functional, still maintained, but with nothing to lift. While this was happening, the holding company sold 185 acres of the historic dockland, the exact ground where the Titanic was built, to a property developer for £47 million. A few years later, that ground became the Titanic Quarter, and at the center of it, a £97 million museum shaped like a ship's bow Titanic. Belfast opened in 2012, on the centenary of the sinking. Every day, thousands of tourists walk past the Samson and Goliath cranes on their way to look at exhibits about the ship those cranes' predecessors helped build. History had become a visitor attraction. Industry had become an exhibit. And 130 workers were still showing up every morning, clocking in, and wondering how much longer any of it would last. They found out on July 30th, 2019. And what happened next was one of the most surprising moments in British industrial history, not because of how it ended, but because of who came to save it, and what that said about everything that had come before. July 30th, 2019. 130 workers locked themselves inside Harland and Wolff. Their owner, Norwegian offshore drilling company Dolphin Drilling, a subsidiary of the Fred Olsen Group, had filed for bankruptcy in June, following the 2014 oil price collapse. The H&W assets had been listed for sale. No buyer had appeared. The workers had decided they would not leave until someone did something. For 6 weeks, they held the gates. Belfast City Council passed an emergency motion calling for government support. Workers demonstrated outside the Stormont Parliament buildings, chanting in Irish, "Sabail our glows, save our yard." Unite Union official Susan Fitzgerald stood outside the gates and told cameras, "The yard has the largest dry dock in the UK. This is the infrastructure the rest of Europe envies. The government must consider nationalisation." The British government's response: "This is a commercial matter." On August 5th, administrators from BDO were appointed. The workers received their redundancy notices. No bailout, no nationalisation, no intervention. Then, in late September, a small London energy storage company called Infrastrata, which had no shipbuilding experience and limited capital, announced it would buy the yard. On October 1st, 2019, the acquisition completed. The yard reopened under the Harland and Wolff name. Workers stayed. The gates reopened. It looked like a reprieve. But Infrastrata, which eventually renamed itself Harland and Wolff, was a small company that had just inherited a heavy industrial asset with enormous maintenance costs, a workforce that needed retraining, and infrastructure that hadn't seen serious capital investment in decades. They had a vision. The vision required money they didn't yet have. And 5 years later, exactly the same crisis returned. Only this time, the story ended somewhere nobody had predicted, and the price of survival turned out to be something the workers of 1,943, at the peak of those 35,000, might not have recognized at all. In 2022, Harland and Wolff won a contract that was supposed to change everything. 3 fleet solid support ships for the Royal Navy, the vessels that supply HMS Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales with ammunition, food, and equipment at sea. Total contract value, £1.6 billion. The largest military shipbuilding order placed in Belfast since the Second World War. The company started hiring. By late 2023, H&W had broken through 1,000 employees for the first time in decades. But shipbuilding is a business where you spend money for years before you see revenue. H&W needed bridge financing. They borrowed at high interest rates from an American lender called Riverstone. They applied to the UK government for a £200 million loan guarantee to access conventional bank financing at normal rates. The government did not respond. Months passed. On September 16, 2024, Harland and Wolff Holdings announced that the company was insolvent, the second bankruptcy in 5 years. This time, no workers occupied the gates, because this time, a buyer was already there. Navantia, Spain's state-owned shipbuilding group, was already the prime contractor on the FSS project. H&W was its subcontractor. If H&W collapsed, the entire program would collapse with it, and the Royal Navy's supply chain would be in crisis. Navantia had every reason to buy. On December 19, 2024, Navantia announced the acquisition of all 4 Harland and Wolff sites, Belfast, Arnish and Methil in Scotland, and Appledore in Devon. All jobs protected. Over 1,000 employees retained. On January 27, 2025, the acquisition was completed. In Belfast, Navantia's chairman, Ricardo Dominguez, announced a modernization plan. Digital shipbuilding management systems, new steel production lines, full infrastructure upgrades. The first steel cuts for the FSS ships would happen at Appledore in December 2025. All 3 vessels were targeted for delivery before 2032. Harland and Wolff was alive. It was no longer British. It was being kept alive by a Spanish state-owned company precisely because state ownership gives you the ability to absorb short-term losses in service of long-term strategic interests. The very thing the British government had decided, for 40 years, it wasn't willing to do anymore. Which brings us to what all of this actually means, and to the 2 things happening simultaneously, right now, on the same piece of ground in Belfast. From 1,861 to today, 164 years, approximately 1,700 ships, 35,000 workers at peak, 6 aircraft carriers and 2 cruisers in one war, the largest passenger vessel ever built. The decline of Harland and Wolff was not caused by workers who didn't try hard enough, or engineers who weren't skilled enough. It was caused by the collapse of the empire it was built to serve, and by a national industrial policy that chose subsidies over transformation repeatedly over decades until there was almost nothing left to save. Now, on that same ground in East Belfast, 2 things are happening at the same time. In the Titanic Museum, tourists are watching a film about a ship that sank in 1912. Outside, a few hundred meters away, workers are preparing steel for ships that will supply the Royal Navy in the 2030s. One is memory. One is the future. The workers who showed up every morning in 1943 built for an empire that thought it would last forever. The workers showing up in 2025 are building for a navy that belongs to a country still figuring out what it's for. Samson and Goliath are still there. They're still lifting. What they're lifting now, and who they're really working for, that part of the story is still being written. If you want to follow the same thread, what happened to British industrial identity when the empire that organized it disappeared, the next video is already on screen. Same era, same pattern, different industry. The ending is darker.